Okay, welcome back, everybody, and good afternoon this time around. I think that applies for good afternoon or good evening applies for just about everyone. And if it's good morning where you are, then I thank you very much for your willingness to participate at that hour in this event. A little bit of so this is the second panel of our Digital Archives of Atrocity Memory event. It'll be a roundtable discussion, and I will introduce very briefly each of the participants in just a moment. But before I do that, I should add my thanks once again to Hira Jaffrey for running the technological side of this, and more broadly the Yale Macmillan Center for International and Area Studies for their support of this, and the Bill and Dorothy Kempf Foundation, whose support we're using to put on this conference. So the order of activities this afternoon will be, we'll hear from each of our panelists with a sort of short self-introduction. I'll just give sort of names and affiliations to begin with. Then Eve and I have a few questions that we hope will sort of start to stimulate a roundtable discussion. And then we'll take it from there, both audience participants and the panelist participants themselves should feel absolutely welcome to ask their own questions, and hopefully I think there's a lot that we can all learn from one another on this exciting topic. So the panelists that we have with us this afternoon include Alexis Lecoq from the Digital Divide Data Group, and Jacqueline Vincent from Brechin Imaging of the Brechin Group, which is based in Canada. And both of them have been working with the digitization of the Tuol Sleng Museum archives, of course, in Cambodia. We have Paul Rukesha, who is affiliated with the Kigali Genocide Memorial in Rwanda, and Elmina Kulasic, who is affiliated with the Remembering Srebrenica archive in Srebrenica and Sarajevo. I believe there are outposts in both places, but Elmina, please, when it comes your turn, you can correct me on that. So without further ado, and in the interest of time, I'm going to turn it over to those panelists and invite Alex and Jacqueline to start us off with a sort of self-description of their activities, their program, and if you wanted to raise some of your initial questions or concerns at this point in short order, that would be welcome as well. Yeah, exactly. I was going to add, if you're unmute and turn on your cameras when it's your turn to speak, that will be most useful. A reminder to the audience that I should have added is that the question and answer feature is by far the best way to sort of log your prospective contributions to the discussion, and we'll do our best to recognize and transmit what's posted there.
Oh, thank you, David. Hi, everyone. I'm Alexis Lecoq, as David said. And first of all, I would like to thank Yale University and so David, Eve, to organize this. Really interesting topics, and especially this first session was really interesting. So I will talk more about the project rather than myself. So I was the project manager of the Tuol Sleng Genocide Museum Archive Preservation and Digitization Project. So this was a 3-year project organized by UNESCO through the Memory of the World program, and it aimed at preserving, digitizing, and publishing the documents of the museum through a website. So also, we will talk about this, but another part of this big project was to build the capacity of the museum staff on these topics so that they can continue the work later on after we finish this project just 2 months ago. Perfect timing. Jacqueline?
Hello, I'm Jacqueline Vincent, and yes, it's a pleasure and an honor to join in this conference. It's very interesting for me. Beyond the Tuol Sleng project, I was imaging and scanning lead for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada for the Indigenous people with the Indian residential schools. So the two projects have been of great interest. And what I learned on that project, I applied to this project here with Alexis, and specifically tied in with the archives as well as the digitization. So that's all I have to say right now.
No, that's great. Thank you very much, and we'll return to questions for the two of you in short order. But let's first hear next from Paul, please.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes, and hello.
Okay.
On behalf of everyone, I'll say hello back.
Okay. So my name is Paul Rukesha. I work for Aegis Trust, which is United Kingdom's NGO based, and that is running the Kigali Genocide Memorial. It started in 2004 and set up the Archive and Documentation Center, which collected and preserved the testimonies, survivor testimonies, perpetrators, rescuers, and another category that we call elders. And later on, the Archive and Documentation Center became Genocide Archive of Rwanda when we went digital in 2010. And that's when I started working for Aegis Trust as an indexer. I was my job was indexing, giving access to the testimonies that we had collected, going digital so that people can access from the US, from Israel, from Burundi, online, but using keywords so that you can access a specific topic within testimony. And we collaborated with the University of Southern California Shoah Foundation because they were more experienced in terms of indexing process, cataloging, and providing access to the testimonies. But also when we started, we worked with the University of Texas libraries. So they shared with us the interface that we were using to index. So it's been 10 years working on testimonies, on archival materials. So that's me. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Paul. And again, we will certainly be circling back to you to hear more in depth about those experiences. And finally, Elmina, I invite you to talk about the Srebrenica archive, and you can answer my question of your location of Sarajevo versus Srebrenica as well.
Yes. Well, thank you. I'm very humbled to be part of this event, and thank you for organizing it and for shining light on this very important topic, not only for the academics and the rest of the world, but especially for the survivors who are the driving force behind the work that we do. I am the country director for Remembering Srebrenica. And Remembering Srebrenica is a UK organization, but works very closely with the survivors in Bosnia. But my experience working on archiving personal testimonies of survivors actually started in 2012 with the Genocide Film Library. And we work very closely with the Memorial Center in Srebrenica Potocari, and they are now the leading institution in Bosnia, trying to establish a proper archive where the testimonies of the Srebrenica survivors specifically will be accessible worldwide. At this point in Bosnia, we do not have accessibility to all of the testimonies, but we are working towards that goal. When it comes to remembering Srebrenica, they started their work in 2013 with the goal to learn the lessons from Srebrenica. And they work very closely with educational institutions in the UK, but also worldwide. And they, before the pandemic, organized delegations to Srebrenica. So they focused on communities in the UK, bringing them to Bosnia to meet with the survivors and to learn firsthand from the survivors what happened in July of '95. At this point, we are also trying to cover other stories from around Bosnia, especially when it comes to the year 92, 93, and 94. Because Srebrenica, the genocide did take place, the killings did take place in July of '95, but the war started in '92 and the atrocities took place from '92 and on. So it's a very long journey for us in terms of digital archiving. We have a lot more material that is not digital archiving in Bosnia rather than that is accessible, but we are getting there, and I'm sure there will be a lot of the answers that I will learn from today in terms of what some of our next steps should be. So thank you for having me.
Well, thank you for being here, and I certainly hope so. I'm going to turn it over to my co-host Eve to start our sort of questioning round here, if I may.
Right. So hello, everyone, and thanks so much for being here, both to the panelists and also to everybody who's watching this webinar today. So one of the questions that comes up with digitalization of archives is always this question about the proliferation of the images that are contained in that archive that, as we all know, happens a lot more easily when it's online than when it's in its paper form. And I think that sort of concern was out there in the past, but in the last couple of weeks, I think that has all come to the forefront of many people's minds when we've had that recent event happen initially with the misuse of the photos from Tuol Sleng, where the images were colored without the permission of the museum and without the families of those people in the images necessarily even knowing about it. They were colored, and in some cases the expressions changed, which of course spread across the internet like wildfire. And Alex, you know that was not the only case. So you and I already were in a conversation before that about those same images, both images from the same collection, I should say, also being altered and for being so-called art and being sold in home decor stores. So this is kind of the worst kind of scenario you can imagine with these kinds of images. And so this question that has been around for some time really, but is now very clear is what do we do with something like this? How do we at the same time preserve these images and make them available for people worldwide so they don't have to actually go to the museum to see them, and at the same time stop this kind of tampering with these images, you know, for respect for the victims and their families. And perhaps Jacqueline and Alex, you want to take that one first.
Sure. Thank you, Eva. So let's start with the hot topic. So about this case, first of all, I would like to talk about, let's call it the positive aspects of this. Of course, there was all this turmoil, but at the end, it helped during these difficult times of COVID-19 and other difficulties to remember the genocide and remember the victims. So especially in these months, because it's April, it's the anniversary of the fall of Phnom Penh. I think if there's a small, a little Positive aspect of this would be this: it was the fact that it helped the population to remember, and also it's helped mobilize the population through engagements in the social media, or engagements through a petition in change.org. So this is a positive aspect. Now, now that I talked about this, talking about this, I would like to separate two things. There's the commercial usage and another type of usage. So for example, if it's a commercial usage, like the example you gave, of course, this fall under the copyright law. And for the artistic usage, then it's a bit more blur. So that's why I would say that first it would be to refer to the local law. What does it says? We have, of course, the law on copyrights and related rights from 2005 in Cambodia. And the same year, there was the law on archives. And both state that there should not be any commercial usage of this material, because owned by the Sleng Genocide Museum and the ministry. Regarding the artistic usage, the law on copyright only said that it would protect the usage if it's for education purpose, not for artistic purpose. So this is another topic. Related to the proliferation, there was just one thing that we did in order to prevent this was to add a watermark on all the images that we publish. This will help a lot, but like Christian said, you are a bit tech savvy. You're able to alter the image and then modify it for your purpose. So this is not really the only solution. I think this is a risk. This is a risk we also take. Beside the fact that we have the law that can protect us in a local context, Cambodia, this is a risk that we take when we decide to open up all these images of the archives.
Great. Does anybody else want to respond to that as well?
Yes. At the Kigali Genocide Memorial, we have many photographs that we use to commemorate the genocide against the Tutsi, especially this month of April, May, June, and July, 3 months of remembering. And we have difficulties of, because we have collected so many photographs. We have more than 20,000 photographs of victims. And just a few of them have the consent form. And the consent form is the agreement that we have with the victims or the siblings of the survivors that agree for us to use those photographs, to post them, to share with the researchers, to use them in books. And so when we started, the center started, we didn't have that kind of procedures. So now it's becoming a problem. We have so many photographs, but that we can't use without any consent form. So that's a problem. So what are we doing? We are trying to find the people who donated the photographs. So we go back and then we talk with them. So whenever it's possible to have a consent form to use those materials, but we specify. So we used to specify that their materials are for only educational artistical use, not commercial. And that also applies to the audiovisual testimonies, because we do collect life histories of people. And we do receive so many requests from around the world for researchers, filmmakers who want to feature some clips, some features of the testimonies. But again, the problem is that, and sometimes they ask for the commercial use, to use that material, but also to allow their partners to use that material, the use and the reuse and so on. So the problem we have is that for the online requesters, they can't use for commercial purpose. And that's a problem we are facing. And again, on the other hand, we need something to support the center, the archive, because collecting a testimony is costly. And we kind of balance not offending the survivors or other people who donate their materials. At the other hand, we are trying to find a way to support the work we do. And as a solution, we came up with, so for example, when there's a museum from Berlin in Germany that asking, for example, a photograph of a machete or a pipe or something, a tool that was used in the genocide. So we give them the photographs, the high resolution photographs, and we agree the tools that we collected ourselves, not belonging to anyone, that we can sell. We can say, okay, let's have an agreement for commercial use. You give us like €100, and then we will use that picture in the museums around Germany or with other partners. But for the materials belonging to survivors and other people, that's a problem. So we are still dealing with it, looking at the laws, at the copyright laws, what it says, and also dealing with emotions from the survivors, not offending survivors. That's our prime objective. Yeah, in brief, that's how we deal with it.
Thank you. Let's see. Elmina, did you want to say something about this issue as well, or should we?
I do. I want to say something along the lines that Paul said, except that in Bosnia, because we are still searching for the remains of the victims, and because especially the commemoration of the Srebrenica genocide, it's still an annual commemoration where we bury the remains of the victims. No one in Bosnia has actual rights when it comes to that footage, when it comes to that commemoration, because the media is invited, so are artists, so is everyone from around the world. But when it comes to actual material that either the NGO sector collects through different projects that they have, the Memorial Center, or even Remembering Srebrenica, we also work very closely with the survivors. But there is another component in Bosnia. We have the cases at the International Courts for former Yugoslavia, where they have a huge archive of not only the items that they have found around mass graves or right after the fact of the genocide, but also the witnesses' accounts. And we also have the International Commission for the Missing Persons, where they also have their own archive. So in Bosnia, even though we all work as partners, we also have to sort of individually contact everyone to receive that permission. But just like Paul said, our main focus is on the survivors, because the genocide happened recently and the survivors are still alive. And in Bosnia, it's actually the victims associations that have even led the movement to establish the Memorial Center in Srebrenica. So they are still in the forefront, asking people if they have any items, if they want to share their personal stories, to share them with Remembering Srebrenica, with the Memorial Center, and also with international partners and projects. So because we really call it a living post-genocide society, that we are still only focusing firstly on survivors, and then who will get either a copy of a personal testimony or an image. So when it comes to commercial use, I think everyone in Bosnia is very, very cautious to even imply any commercial use for any of the items that we collect, unless they work directly with a museum such as the War Childhood Museum. Then they have their own sort of approach in how they work with survivors and how the survivors feel about some of their images being used for commercial purposes. But I do believe, I do agree with Paul, it's a very survivors-oriented approach in terms of how we use the material we have.
And I wanted to add, by the way, just simply that to let everyone know, and to that Christian Groh, who's gave us such a fabulous and detailed presentation this morning, is back with us on the panel. And Christian, you should feel welcome to chime in on any of these questions that we're asking. I think this is a topic in a way that you were able to address already. So it's not necessarily an invitation to do so right now, but please feel free over the course of the next hour. The panelists generally, you can turn on your camera or turn off your mic, and we will recognize you. I think the raise hand feature also exists. But I'm glad, Christian, that you're able to come back. And I saw you turn on your camera a second ago. Does that mean you wanted to chime in?
No, that was just to show that I'm still around.
Okay, good.
I will use the raise hand if I wanted to say something.
Just establishing ground rules here on the fly to some extent. Yeah, oh, go ahead, Alex.
Yeah, sorry, David. I just wanted to add. So Elmina, yeah, you said it right, and I think we have the same local context in Cambodia. Having this commercial use in Cambodia would be people would be really cautious, careful, because they are aware of the social or legal action that can be done after. What about if, in this case, it was done in another country? So we are talking about international, if I can say, ethics and potential legal action. We have less power in this case, because I'm sure that if it happened in Cambodia by a Cambodian artist, this would have been solved really quickly and with strong actions.
Right. I guess the follow-on question to all of you is: have you noticed? Have a lot more victims' families been contacting the archives out of concern about this problem now that it's become readily apparent? About, people saying, how do I ensure that the documents or the photographs of my loved ones or something are not going to be used in these kinds of ways, or asking about the protections, whether there's any protections for that.
Or even, if I can add to that, less sort of specifically, do the people whose voices and artifacts, or family members' artifacts, are being cataloged and archived, do they typically express concerns about the potential use and dissemination of those artifacts and testimonies and voices?
Yes, so I'm sorry, I won't be able to answer this precisely because I'm not a representative of the museum, and I'm sure that I see in the attendees we have names that are that are representative of the museum that can please feel free to talk if to answer this question, because this is an information I don't have. Sorry.
Elmina or Paul, can you speak to that? Is there, do you encounter much reluctance or resistance when you're trying to add to the archives of people who are wary about entering their material, their testimony, whatever it might be, into the sort of public domain?
I'll go. Our biggest challenge is really getting the survivors comfortable to even share their testimonies or anything that they have from before the war or during the war. But once we gain their trust that it will be used primarily for educational purposes, they do feel comfortable. And once they share it with us, they have that trust component. And we haven't had a case in Bosnia where any of the testimonies or any of the artifacts have been used in any way where the survivors felt that they needed to reach out. But they do expect us to stay in touch with them. So our work is not to only be in contact with the survivors once, so we either record their testimonies or receive their artifacts. They really do expect us to be in touch with them on a continuous basis, and we do that. We do maintain that relationship, and it helps in terms of if anything happened to any of their stories or anything that they have shared with us, we would be able to communicate it with them. But I have not had a case yet where I had to explain to any of the survivors or their family members. But I also think that stems back to the work of the International Commission for Missing Persons and their approach and how they worked with survivors in terms of searching for the remains and how the artifacts that were found were stored, preserved, and used at the ICTY in local cases. So that approach really helped because it was very personal, also very painful. But I would assume once we have more access worldwide that we will have these challenges and that we will have to tackle all of these questions. And our copyright law in Bosnia is very vague and basic. So I'm sure that down the road, the survivors associations will be looking at the laws, not only in Bosnia, but also in EU and worldwide, and how they can protect the survivors more.
Thank you. And Paul, please feel free.
Yes, I'm giving you a story. What happened? There's a survivor. It was we collected her story back in 2006. And when we went online in 2010, we posted her testimony online, public. We had the consent form. She had agreed that anyone from around the world, in Rwanda, everywhere, can access the testimony, can publish a book about it, can, from when we have the testimony. And when she saw herself on the screen in a public lab, and then she said, no, I don't want to see myself. Please take down the testimony. And we had the consent form. So what we did is to agree with her. So we would take down the testimony, and then we would work with her because our process of collecting also involves say supporters, counselors, who support psychologically, who make a briefing and debriefing before the recording and after the recording. So we worked with our psychologist, worked with her just to explain the impact of a testimony, why it's important, and if she's still okay for us to post the testimony. And later on, she agreed, like 1 year later, she agreed. They said, oh, that's great. Like, let's put it on, back on. Another story is another young lady, and she was married to non-survivor. And she didn't want her testimony to feature publicly online. She said, I don't know what people might think of me. I don't know if I'm gonna be isolated or ostracized because I'm a survivor of the genocide against the Tutsis. So it was the time, it was the years of 2010, 11, 12. So people were not sure how to deal with a public testimony, someone crying on a camera, before a camera. So it was a total chaos. So, but today, with the internet penetration, people being aware of, being less afraid of facing the camera. So people are embracing their testimonies to go online. They even understand that it's countering the genocide denial. So it's being positive. It's going in the positive direction. Yeah, that's the experience we have.
Oh, great, thank you, and thank you all. In fact, it's fascinating to hear. I actually wanted to, Eve and I were talking in between sessions, and a question popped up that I think sort of inspired by Christian's talk to some extent, which is this question of, is there a difference between collecting, archiving physically or analog, and archiving digitally? I wonder, particularly, I suppose, most likely to be noticed in the last year when a large proportion of everyone's existence migrated to the digital realm. Does the job change? Are there different challenges to running a digital archive versus managing or curating or archiving in the analog world?
So just to follow on a little bit with what David was saying there, one of the things we were thinking of, even a step further than that, I should say, was that whether there was different types of jobs, like we don't know because we're not in the archiving world exactly. So we were kind of wondering, with this move to digital, and obviously there's the use of AI to do a certain amount of analysis of the archives, but does it require new types of jobs and new types of people doing new types of jobs, such as data analysis and so forth? And how does that really then change the archive and what it is and what the job of the archive is into something that it was not previously before, or not exactly like it was previously before? You see it in other areas outside of archives, like in, say, the business world or something like that. But we're wondering specifically about this world of archives and as the documents are digitized and then they're accessed differently, they're analyzed differently, and so forth. What does that change look like? I see, Christian, you've got your hand up there.
Very briefly, I'm very eager to hear what Alex, Paul, Elmina, and Jacqueline want to say about it. I think it changes our profession generally, because we are already confronted with digital borns, with material that is digital in itself. But I'm very confident there. It's a new technology. We have learned to work with books, then we have learned to work with paper, with microfilms, and so on. We will learn to deal with digital material. In Germany, where I've had my profession, where I've learned to become an archivist, it is also already part of the curriculum. So what might be more interesting is to see whether it changes the way we, who are all dealing with analog material, and we want the analog material to become digital, to make it better accessible, whether that changes our work, and whether there are specific issues with the topics we're all dealing with genocide. Does that make a difference whether it's digital or analog? I mean, the main thing is, I think it's better accessible, which is a good thing, I think, but it's also better subject, or it is a subject to misuse, as we've heard in the beginning of the discussion. So what does that change? Not the methodologies or the ways we deal with it, but the ethical issues around that.
Yes, like Christian said, it doesn't change necessarily the methodology, whether it's analog or digital. But it's true, we can see a shift because it's digital. Of course, the role and responsibilities of an archivist have changed as well. We require maybe more. If we talk about preservation of digital material, we require more the archivists to have IT skills in order to ensure the long-term preservation of the material. And when it comes to analysis, like you said, we will require more archivists that have at least a small experience on a database and big data analysis. So it changed a bit the way they're working and the skills that it requires, but not the methodology.
I could say something about, not directly the question, but related. And when I worked with Alexis at the beginning of our project, and we had the archives to look at, we had to figure out, well, how are we going to present this? So one of the things that we had done with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, it was a document library. So how do we approach the hard copy of the traditional archives with a new digital copy? So do we replicate it exactly? Do we reassign the relationships of the documents? Or do we take it as we find it? And so based on what we had done for the TRC, Alexis and I and other people working with us decided that we would keep the relationship as we found it. So if page 2 was ahead, we left it as page 2, but we would put it in front. But there was a way to trace how we found the archives so that we didn't change that original. And that's something that any project that you're starting, it's very valuable to look at. Yeah, here's the digital, here's the physical, but how will we relate those two? And that's a discussion that needs to be had at the beginning of your project. And this is what we've decided, to make sure we keep them all separate but related. And Alexis may want to add something on that as well.
Oh, no, you said everything, but it's true that for example, when I said that the methodology didn't change because, like you said, Jacqueline, we still have this principle of original order, whether we talk about physical assets, physical material or digital material. We try to apply the same principle of, let's call it traditional archive, into these digital archives.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And Elmina, you had your hand up a second ago. Did you want to add to this part of the conversation?
I did. We all spoke about the preservation and the collection for the archives, but I wanted to mention just the presentation. And especially now with COVID, we've come into a situation where we need PR advice. How do we make people sort of understand that the testimonies, the archives are important within one sentence or two, and how we actually have to use social media as well. So even though the methodology and the methods of archiving have not really changed much in terms of the past few years of how we work with survivors, we do have to consult others. How do we publicly approach the subject that we work with, make it understandable, and also now readable, so that others understand what it is that we're collecting, what it is that they will learn from the archives, and why they are important.
And Paul, you were on camera for a moment earlier. Did you want to contribute as well?
I wanted to say something about it because we have both uh, um, a physical archive and digital archive. The physical archive is where we keep the master tapes, like VHS tapes, DVD tapes that are there, and we have policy and procedures how to acquire those materials, how to labeling them so that the digital numbers correspond to master tapes in any physical. This, for example, when you have a photograph online with the ID, the online ID, and then you go in physical, and then you get that physical tape. You get that physical photographs. Sorry. So that's how we do. But now, after, I mean, we moved. Before, we were using DV tapes, and then we would keep them. But now we use a digital card. And then there's a problem of storage, because now it's 4K. It's being really going fast, updated, and then we have nice images, high resolution images, the images that can be used on a television, on we can share with someone who wants to make a documentary. So it requires IT infrastructure. It requires money. So that's where challenges with funding every year, every program, education program we have. So we beg, we include to the funders, donors, that we need the materials, that the educational materials that we get from the archival materials need to be preserved. So we make sure that they understand the relationship of the education, the teaching and learning materials that we develop from the archival materials, that there's a relationship, that there's some money that could be allocated to that, to IT infrastructure, to keep it running, to increase the storage, because more and more images are coming in, more testimonies are coming in. So we need to preserve, we need to maintain, we need to sustain it for a longer period of time. So it's always that pressure to get funding, so that we can keep increasing the storage. We can make sure that the hard drives don't get frozen, that we have the devices that can, from the analog, convert from analog to digital. So it's really challenging. Yeah.
Right. I'm glad that you brought that up, Paul, because I think that often when people think of the digital, they think of it, oh, well, it's so durable on the one hand compared to the material, because, you know, after all, it's been digitized and it's stored on a computer, with forgetting the fact that that these computer systems also need to be maintained, and things go out of date, and some systems end up becoming obsolete as well. But there is a question actually that I wanted to return to also in Elmina's, what Elmina is saying about context. I think that context is indeed an interesting question. That it's one thing to put an image up on the web, it's another thing to, it depends on where it is on the web, how that image might be read, so to speak. And I guess that question, and Dave and I have been sort of talking about this for a while, that we've had, is this, especially with social media, and that includes not only like Facebook, but it also includes sites like Flickr and Pinterest and things like that. that with so many of these images that are on these online archives are so easily copied and downloadable. And then people post them on all kinds of pages, on all kinds of forms of social media. And they can essentially label those collections whatever they like. It could be their at a personal interest or building a family, history of some sort, but it could also be other things. And I guess I'm wondering a little bit whether in the archive world there, especially with mass atrocities, whether these discussions are had about the use of these archival photos by individuals. It's a lot more participatory. It's true than if they're just in a warehouse or a museum somewhere. But how do you see the use of these images and documents and so forth as they go out there into the online world? How do you interpret that, I guess? Is this something that you see continuing, and that's, overall it's a good thing, although it can be misused from time to time, or you see that sort of thing slowing down somehow in the future, or should it, put some restrictions? Christian?
Yeah, I want to make it very briefly and touch upon what you just said, and also what Elmina said. I agree with Elmina that it's very important to use social media and PR ways to make the world aware of the material we have, or we have. But it's also, and I can tell you from my own personal experience, it's a constant struggle how to do that, because if you're restricted to a few signs or a few lines, as in Twitter, it's very hard to bring over a very complex issue like the Holocaust or any other genocide to the world outside there. And you just mentioned it, Eve, if you use Flickr or Pinterest, it's even worse. It's nothing, not bad. It's just worse things that you have to consider doing. So I think it's necessary to be present on social media and to present your material, but you have to reconsider ethical issues, legal issues, and you have to be aware of the misuse that might happen. And I think you have to be very considerate what you write about your material, and then it's posted in the right context.
Any other?
Yes, and I would say I would take the example of the Library of Congress that use social media to have this crowdsourcing approach. They have a photo, but didn't know any context about it, and then would ask the people, the user of social media, to provide more information. For this case, it worked, and it's true. I agree with Christian. With atrocities, it's a bit more difficult. You have to be very careful. And to answer to you, Eve, I believe that it's going to be more and more spread, the usage of social media, but at the same time, the internet is becoming more participatory. So how are we going to go with that movement and trying to kind of take the best out of it, like the Library of Congress has done with this crowdsourcing initiative?
Elmina, go ahead. Oops, Elmina?
I'm here. What I wanted to add, the reason I brought this up is because that also a lot of donors that fund projects view social media as a source of measuring the impact that a project has. So they do look at Twitter, at Facebook, at all of the platforms, at least for remembering Srebrenica, one of the aspects is that they view that as an impact format. And even though maybe some of us do take all of the ethical and legal aspects into consideration, and we are trying to be very, very careful in terms of what we write, how we post it, how we lead the discussion, especially on Twitter. Sometimes it gets really heated. Sometimes it does provide a form of engagement. But what concerns me is that this is becoming a formula for impact measurement. And I'm not sure if it is the best formula, but since the internet is becoming more engaging, as Alexis said, I think that in the future, we will see that it will become an important aspect, at least for those of us that are seeking funding for the project that we deem are important to have.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a, it's a fascinating concern. And I think speaks to a broader issue of managing archives when you're, and Paul has spoken to this as well, when your funding is sort of donor dependent, or there's never enough resources and you depend upon outside donors for more. That certainly shapes what you do. Related to this, and I want to turn to a question from the question and answer feature here. Related to this is a question about, well, I see it as a question about the connection between digital archives of mass atrocities and transitional justice mechanisms. The question I'll read from Antonella Giordano is, in Argentina, the first efforts of digital archives were focused years ago on victims and places, mainly because it happened when the dictatorship was still going, and the effort was to search for disappeared people. But later on, the archives started responding to a pattern based on the open legal causes. Nowadays, it's still that way, and it didn't come back to focus on the victims. And she goes on to ask, so which is the variable guiding the efforts in each place, and why? That is for legal reasons or for searching for personal data. But broadly, in each of the cases here, especially with at least in the cases of Bosnia with the ICTY, Cambodia with the ECCC, and Rwanda with the ICTR, and then Gachacha in Rwanda, and other prospective truth and reconciliation like mechanisms, there is invariably some demand for archived material that arises from these transitional justice mechanisms. How much does that shape what you do, either positively or perhaps does it constrain what you're able to do as a result?
Hi, okay, I will go first. So talking about the ECCC, actually, it didn't change the way we are organizing the archives at the museum. What it helped a lot was to give this strong foundation for us to continue the work afterwards. So through this locomotive that was ECCC that enabled to have more funds and then more projects to digitize and to index and to make this public. This helped the museum to continue this job. So it was a great start, but it doesn't mean that that they are following the same method as the ECCC. Of course, they are they have a strong relationship between each other and help each other, but two different entities, so two different organizations, but with the same materials in a way.
Others, I'm actually, well, I mean, I'm interested in all the cases, but Paul, yeah, I'm glad you've turned your mic on there, because I'm interested in the connection between, I mean, ICTR is closed now, but Gachacha is closed as well, but the archive has been up for 15 years. Was it a resource? Were they resources for each other in some ways?
Yes, you will start with the Gachacha. So the Gachacha documents are being handled by the Rwandan government, but well, okay, my colleagues, because we kind of separated. Some of the colleagues separated and created a company, a business that deals with the archival materials. But for us, we are NGO. We are not. Initially, we dealt. We were the government of Rwanda contacted us because of our expertise, and we together with the USC Shua Foundation, with the NIOD from the Netherlands, the Institute of War and the Holocaust, and KCL, King's College London. So we partner, and Aegis Trust for organization. So we were working on Gachacha documents. As you may know, it's more than 45 millions of documents, court proceedings, testimonials, file cases. So all those pages we have to we were to reboxing, labeling, organizing the physical archive, and scanning, and creating metadata and indexing. It's a billion Rwandan francs project that were funded by the Rwandan government, and that Aegis Trust is working on, but with another company that was created for that business. But we are kind of still leading, giving orientation to that the archival process. For the ICTR, so it's still discussion, because the UN said, so this is our property, and the Rwandan government said, no, this is the genocide against the Tutsi. This is about Rwanda. We should have the archive set up in Rwanda, and we are not going to accept it. So and the Arusha, the ICTR said, oh, okay, we should set up an archive here in Tanzania, in Arusha, and then if you want copies, you can get copies, but we keep the originals here. And the UN wants the archive, so it is still in discussion. We don't know what is going to happen, but hopefully, if we get the archives, that will be the best ideal for us. It's more work. It's it's our history. Yeah.
Thank you, Paul.
Elmina, you go ahead. Let's respond later. Or Jacqueline.
I wanted to mention that in the case of Bosnia, even though the ICTY has closed, there are still ongoing cases with the UN mechanisms, but they do have their community outreach project where they do work with survivors, and especially the Memorial Center in Bosnia. So we have access to the archive, but the decisions have not been made where that archive will be located after all of the cases are completed. I know that Serbia has requested for that archive to be transferred to Belgrade because it is the criminal tribunal of former Yugoslavia, and the archive of former Yugoslavia is located in Belgrade. So we do have a situation in Bosnia where the debate is coming within the next few years. It's not happening in the present day because there are still ongoing cases, but I hope that, Paul, we will have a bit of a better luck with the UN in terms of where they want the archive to be physically placed. But what the Memorial Center is doing right now is that they are not making the archive accessible more to the local community in Bosnia, but more readable. So they recently published something called the Genocide Papers. So they looked at the documents of the Parliament of Republika Srpska, the decision that they made in '92 that led to some of the atrocities that took place. So we are sort of approaching it in a educational way, hoping that once the debate starts where the actual archive will be, that Bosnia will be ready to have the archive in Bosnia. But we do understand that former republics of Yugoslavia will probably want part of that archive to be placed in some of their either national archives or museums. So we'll see. I think Bosnia will be an interesting case in the next few years.
Elmina? Oh, you're done. Okay, Jacqueline.
Sorry, I forgot the camera. It's not directly related to the Tuol project, but it is, David, you mentioned about the TRC and relationships of archives. With the TRC, it was a document collection project. So we had the task of going to the different church archives across the country, and researchers determined what documents within each of those archives was relevant to the Indian residential school system. They were collected, and they became then a new archive that there was a lot of discussion as to how that would unfold. It ended up being stored or put into the University of Manitoba and became the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. So it started in various different places of the source of the documents to create a new document library that contained audio, visual, mostly physical documents, and some photos. But it was really a combined from different places into one. And in fact, the federal government had to produce documents too.
Can I just ask if that process included digitizing the church records, or
yes.
is it more physical? It's both.
Oh, yeah. So that was my part of it, was to lead the digitization, but the researchers actually determined what we had to photograph and digitize and scan. But yeah, so it became a new archive, a new document library.
And in that case, I imagine there must be many instances of sensitive material, stories of relating to the physical and mental abuse of people who may still be alive today.
Absolutely.
How is the digital, well, both the analog and the digital archive sort of dealing with those issues?
So I'm not sure how they're dealing with it now under the NCTR. The man that's heading that is Rai Moran. And so it will be an interesting talk. You could, if you wanted, I could give you his contact information. But yeah. So there were, as I was telling Alexis, there were audio and video statements given. And some were given under the context that they would be private, and some were given as public statements. So some people wanted them destroyed after they came up with their 94 recommendations to the Canadian government. But yeah, so I think they were still figuring out, some were sensitive and some were not.
Yeah, thank you.
That might be a good time to switch to one of the questions in our Q&A here. Chaiman asks, why do you think testimonials are important, and what experience does it relate to? So I think that kind of follows on exactly from what you were saying, Jacqueline, on these statements. Can you say something about the value of these statements and having them public?
So the value of the statements would be, well, there was a few, but I can mention two. One is educating the public and mainstream Canadian people, because many people didn't know what was happening in these residential schools. And then, so it's education and history, but then it was also even more, it's for healing of the survivors. So in some cases you had 2 or 3 generations of Aboriginal people that went to these schools, forced to go to them, and much trauma, intergenerational trauma. And by doing these statements, people learned for the first time what had happened to their parents and their grandparents. And it was a healing process. It wasn't overnight, but it was part of the healing process. So that will be a benefit of talking about it. And I could see even for the TRC, I mean, for the Tuol Sleng Museum, many people just didn't want to know about it. Is what I understood. Part of the reason we were doing the project is to bring that information. And so many people I talked to when I was over there had never gone to the Tuol Sleng Genocide Museum. It was like that was behind them. And Alex, you'd be better to speak to that, but this is what I know, I heard. There's actually people from on the participants that are here involved in the project too. They might want to say something in the Q&A. Did that answer your question?
It does, and I think it opens up several more questions for others on the panel here. You know, part of what we heard about this morning was an archive that was in some sense, I don't know if primarily used, as it might be too strong a word, but frequently used by relatives looking for trying to identify missing family members initially, and then maybe doing family tracing or understanding more about their family over the years. In Bosnia and Rwanda and Cambodia, archives may initially sort of take on the second role I just mentioned, which was looking for or serving as a resource for testimony, getting the truth out there. And less of a sort of family education about one's own background and one's own family. It's almost more of a national purpose and less of a familial purpose. But I wonder if you see that shifting now. Is there, as we move into a world in which, say, in Rwanda, for example, over half the population was born after 1994. That might be true with respect to Bosnia in 1995 as well. But is there a shift in the kind of purpose of testimonies from, or that the way users are perceiving testimonies from something like a sort of fundamental presentation of the truth to something that's still obviously the truth, but also seen as a family heritage and understanding about oneself and with family members playing a greater role in the use of the archives.
Yes. Yeah, I can tell you a word about it. So collecting a testimony is to keep the memory of what happened for the future, for the present and the future generations. So as you said, David, we have people who were born right after the genocide and during even the genocide who are 27 years old. So they don't know what really happened. So it's very important to tell them what happened, but most importantly, what caused that to happen before the genocide. How was life like before the genocide? What caused that lack of humanity to manifest itself during that time? Because everyone is human, but what causes a human to lose that humanity to the point that committing mass atrocity? So it helps the youth to analyze, to really analyze, because our testimonies are structured in a way that the pre-genocide is given importance, that the childhood of the victims, the interaction with others, the ethnicity problem issues, the politics around identity, all of this, we need to bring that picture to people without hurting, without harming the minds of people, in a way that we transform the stories that are told into the materials and create programs. For example, we created a program that is called Education for Sustainable Peace in Rwanda. And our methodology is storytelling, is to have a survivor or a perpetrator who confessed, who was released from the prison, who is willing to rebuild the country as others, telling the story in his or her own words. The people get that attention, gives that attention to someone who lived the experience. For example, speaking of myself, I became aware of the Holocaust when I first heard the testimony of a Holocaust survivor. When I got to index to catalog that testimony for 2 hours, that's when I became aware of the Holocaust and its magnitude and what it caused among humans. So I would say it's keeping the memory, education, and education again. Yes.
Thank you, Paul. Elmina.
I will say something along the lines that Paul just said, but in the case of Bosnia, we have widespread institutional genocide denial. And this also stems from the peace agreement where the country is divided in 2 entities and the district Brčko. And we do not have one Ministry of Education, but we have 12. So we don't have a common curriculum. We don't even have a common narrative in Bosnia where it is agreed how the future generations or the current generations or the generation that was born during or right after the war were taught about the war. We have a highly contested history, not only from the 90s, but also stemming back all the way to the Second World War. So in Bosnia, the survivors' testimonies are not only crucial in understanding what happened during the war and what kinds of crimes were committed, but also why it is important to know and why we have to understand the past in order to move or even talk about the future. Because while we talk about what happened in the 90s during the war, we are also talking about the government structure in Bosnia, possible joining of the EU. So we have other issues that the government structure, the structure where we should have all of the tools available to help our local communities deal with the past, they are very much not present in Bosnia. So in Bosnia, besides the ICTY, which has also been undermined by our neighboring countries and looked upon as, an international court that is against, one group of people and favoring the other, the survivors' testimonies end up being the educational material that Paul is talking about. We try to tell the survivors that they are the educators, and this is how they mainly tell their stories. And we also focus on their lives before the war, how they survived during the war, but also why they are sharing their testimonies. And this is where the younger generation really gets inspired in a way to work in their local communities, because they learn from the survivors why it is important to understand the past and why we have to look for the signs so that we can prevent a genocide happening in the future in Bosnia. So really in Bosnia, the survivors are the educators because we don't have the curriculum needed to educate the younger generation the proper history and how we can deal with the past.
Thank you, Elmina. I think you raised a very important point about the role of the connection between archives and narratives about the past and some kind of cohesive narrative about the past and the need and the connections with education. We have quite a few questions in the queue here, so I think we'll just go at them here. So the first one, the next one is from Armin Marsubian, and he asks, have you had any experience with dealing with inauthentic or falsified items that have found themselves in your archives? Is there a value for archiving such intentionally falsified evidence and artifacts? Who would like to take that one? Has anyone found any falsified artifacts encountered that in your experiences?
Yes. So there's a testimony of survivors of a survivor from the Western province. I would say it was not falsified, but that person had, I think, psychological problem, and we compared the testimony that was given before, because he gave the testimony 2 times, and we wanted to publish a book, which is also online. The book is called We Survived. It's a testimony of 28 survivors, and so they were children by the time of the genocide. And we found some discrepancies in the testimony, the dates, the historical, but it was not like a voluntary falsification. It was rather the psychological troubles that he had that made him confuse the date. So, for example, he would say, the RPF captured this town in May 20th, but historically it's known that the RPF captured that town in June 2nd. So that kind of historical accuracies, but it was not too serious, but we preferred it just to take it off so that he deals with the problem, and then because there were other survivors in that area that had the accurate history. Yeah.
Great, thank you, Paul. Anyone else should feel welcome to chime in, but we're going to make this a little bit of a lightning round, if you will, in that we can move on to other questions as well. We don't need to have everyone chime in on each question. I think some of them are in fact directed. Here's one that's not directed at anyone in particular, but might be interesting, from an anonymous attendee. Have you had any cases of interference from the government that they did not want to see everything published, or I would say, a particular archival testimony or item published or archived? Or it may be difficult to answer that question, I understand, as well.
Yeah, I can respond to that. Yes, it happened to us, but it was not the government that did not want us to post. It was historical sensitivities. It's a story. So it happened when we were launching the archive. It was on 10th December 2010. It was on the Day of Human Rights, I think, if I'm not mistaken. And the person who was by then he was a prime minister. That person, it happened that his father contributed to the conflict in the 60s, that the anti-Tutsi propaganda. But so we said, so this is an important person, prime minister. He's coming to archive, so it's better not to show him some footages back in the 60s. His father talking about how the Tutsis are not real Rwandans, how, you know, they are colonizers, things like that. So we blocked that footage. So it's self-censorship. So we didn't want to just to harm, to hurt anyone, to keep that sensitivity. Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you, Paul. Yeah. I think that does address the question in a helpful way. Eve, the next one's directed or mentions your name, so I'll leave it to you.
Okay, this question comes from Lang Sotia. And Sotia asks specifically that Christian answer this question, but I think Alexis and Elmina, if you want to jump in at some point, because the question has to do actually with Cambodia, but I'll read the question. If the young generation of Cambodia wants to learn by reading from the archives, how would we go about reading documents such as from the Pol Pot regime and the Vietnam War? Because it's hard to find these documents. And learn more about the mass killings in the country. It says that we just have some documents in the Khmer language, but we don't. But you know, they indicate in the question that they understand there's more out there. So how would they go about doing that?
Sorry, is it for Christian?
It is, but I go ahead. Why don't you, since the documents are are mostly in Cambodia.
Yeah, so well, there's different points I would like to raise. So first, yeah, like he said, there's not a lot of documents regarding these atrocities. So and we know that Tuol Sleng Genocide Museum have one of the most documented archive about this. So first of all is a work from the researcher to be able to know what are the facts, what actually happened or not, because it's true that there are still some blurry zone that we need to sort out. But the most important would be, to make it part of a curricula, like you mentioned, David. It's a shame, but we don't have that much being taught at school about the genocide. So of course there's mention about this, but we will talk more about the majesty of Angkor Wat than the atrocities of the Khmer Rouge. And if we focus more on this difficult past, then we'll be able to make people, to make the young generation more inspired. But how can we do it? Yeah, first would be to have this research job, making sure that we have all the information and we are not shaping history.
Okay, thank you. Alexis, the question that actually follows from Nada Ross actually is asking kind of a similar question at the end. Is basically how young people can learn more. How can they use the archives and learn more about the past? And in this particular case, they're talking about the Cambodian genocide and also the and they're making the comparison to the Armenian genocide and the information that was offered there, which is of course it happened, years and years long before the Cambodian genocide. So they bring up also this issue of time as possibly being a factor there. But would anyone like to respond to the?
Elmina's got her hand up, so Elmina, please.
Hi, I will not talk about the Cambodian genocide, but I can talk about the Bosnian community and the Bosnian case. Bosnia has a huge diaspora, especially in the United States. And for the younger generation, what the only older generation did, instead of talking directly and recounting their story directly to their children or their community, they started organizing commemorations. And it went parallel with what was happening in Bosnia. And this is why sometimes a lot of questions are raised. How important are commemorations? Are they needed? How do they go alongside with archiving? How do we bring in the institutions into commemorations? But what I have seen, and including myself, I was only 7 years old when the war in Bosnia started. So even though I remember the war vividly and what my family went through, it was still not a topic that we spoke of at home. And I believe that every second generation has the same issue. How do we get this topic started? So we might have all of the material available to the younger generation, but them still not being, I would say, brave enough, not interested enough, but brave enough to go down that road. So at least in the case of the Bosnian communities, commemorations really helped. And I think if other communities can learn something from the Bosnian communities, it's really how do you start with small steps, just sort of bringing the culture back from home. The Bosnian community started with the Bosnian culture, which is very much based around coffee and socializing around coffee. And that naturally went into the conversation about the war. So I hope this helps, but commemorations do have other purposes other than just remembering the victims, but also educating the younger generation and coming together and feeling comfortable in asking some questions, maybe not their parents or their family members directly, but some other community members that are able to talk about what happened to them.
Thank you, Elmina. And I noticed the clock, and I realized that we've more or less run out of time, and the questions keep on coming in. I think some of these on the topic that we're on leads me at least to think of one final question, and Eve might have one final more of hers as well. But it summarizes some of these issues, and it echoes a question I had asked Christian this morning, which is there a way in which archives, especially digital archives, can help inform education efforts and curriculum development so that some of these tasks of educating younger generations can be more widespreadly, can be accomplished on a more widespread basis? And are there things that your respective archives are able to are doing in this respect or have plans to do?
Yes, thank you for that question, David. I think I mentioned it earlier. So we have education program in which we teach peace and values education. Peace and values education as a cross-cutting issue in all subjects from secondary school. Actually, we want to also reach out to primary school, secondary school, and university, and so that the peace and values education with teaching the core values of religious trust, critical thinking, personal responsibility, empathy, and trust. So the archival materials that you have collected contributed a lot in developing the peace and values education program that was incorporated into the national curriculum. The government was attracted to that program so that they accepted that it can be incorporated in those subjects. So for example, if you're learning mathematics or biology, and how a teacher can incorporate the peace and values education into the program. So for that, you have examples, you have stories, stories, examples of, for example, if you're going to buy a bread, and then the seller gives you the balance that you should not expect. How would you that? Would you give back the money or not? So teaching integers like minus and plus, you can also teach the values, the values of honesty, of telling the truth. So for that, we use the stories. We use the stories of personal responsibility. For example, during the genocide, there were people who risked their lives to save the Tutsi who were persecuted. How did they do that? Is it because they resisted the peer pressure from other people? Because it was a la mode to go killing people, to search for the Tutsi, from the babies, women, and to kill them. But some people, even uneducated people, choose to stand up and hide and provide food, hiding. Why? Because they thought critical, just that humanity, to link up to humanity, have humane ideas, humane values, virtues. So that, in brief, the archival materials that we have collected, the stories of rescuers, contributed a lot, survivors, the lessons they give from what they lived, the experience. It helped a lot to design the peace and values education program.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. And in some ways, I think that is really an ideal note on which to wrap up this program. In particular, your mention of the values of humanity. That the promise of digital archives is that they can better serve those values, and the sort of momentous task as archives in the digital era chart their course more and more sort of intentionally is to promote those greater values of humanity, while being aware of the prospects of misuse or inhumane use, unethical use. So sort of building up an ethics of archiving along with the wide variety of other missions that an archive might have, that we've discussed here and there throughout this panel today. So therefore, wrapping up, I want to give Eve a chance to say, to have a last bit as well, but so I'll turn it over to her for a final word. Before I do, though, I'd like to thank all of our panelists, Paul, Elmina, Alexis, Jacqueline, Christian, for appearing today, for enlightening us all, and for the work that you all have been doing and do in your respective contexts. Thanks again also to Hira Jaffrey for running the show, and to the Yale Macmillan Center for their support. Eve?
Right, I just want to second thanks to all of you, and to Hira as well. And I want to thank you, as David said, also for the work that you do. I can say that I myself have benefited from it greatly, not only through my research, but also in a personal manner as well. I'm digging through, certainly the archives in Europe and in Germany, the Arolsen Archives being one of them, the Majdanek Archives being another, and other archives as too. And it's been tremendously helpful. So despite all my apprehensions about everything going digital and what can be done about it, I do stop quite often. I mean, I just contacted my mother the other day and said, maybe you want to have your pictures taken down from Yad Vashem after the whole debacle with the whole moving pictures and colored pictures and all of that, of seeing what can be done with them. So it's not that I am, see that it as being completely unproblematic, but at the same time, I also see the huge benefits that can come from the accessibility of archives and how it allows us as researchers and also in our personal lives to link up these different digital resources together to create some kind of story, and then to be able to tell it and have a better understanding of the past, and also by extension our present. So thank you all very much. If you'd like to turn your cameras on for a moment to so we can say goodbye to our audience, who we're very appreciative for staying with us today and enjoying this wonderful presentation. Thank you.
Thank
Have a
you.
great day.
Thank
too.
you.
Thank you.
Panelists, I encourage you to stay on. This will conclude the public portion, and we'll stop recording slightly. But panelists, shortly, panelists, I would love just to chat for a minute or two, unless you